afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Tax cuts were promised by both the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives ahead of the provincial election. Now that the NDP has been voted back in, are cuts really in the best interest of BC? And we'll be joined by a local baker to find out some tips and tricks for baking and how to avoid any disasters. I'm Amy Bell in for Michelle Elliott, and this is BC Today. And thank you for joining us here on radio, TV, and live stream. You can call us now on our top story. What impact will the proposed NDP tax cuts have on you, and what impact could they have on BC? Our number is 604-669-3733. You can also call us 1-800-825-5950 or hit pound 690. Always, you can email us bctoday@cbc.ca. We'll begin in the U.S., where earlier this morning, President Joe Biden promised Americans a peaceful transition to Trump's second term in the Oval Office.
The people vote and choose their own leaders, and they do it peacefully. And we're in a democracy. The will of the people always prevails. Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory, and I assured him that I direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition. That's what the American people deserve. Yesterday, I also spoke with Vice President Harris. She's been a partner and a public servant. She ran an inspiring campaign, and everyone got to see something that I learned early on to respect so much: her character. She has a backbone like a ramrod. She has great character, true character. She gave her whole heart and effort, and she and her entire team should be proud of the campaign they ran.
And when Biden won the election 4 years ago, the transition period was tumultuous. Donald Trump claimed the vote was rigged, and his attempt to overrun the results culminated in the January 6th assault on the Capitol. It is 12:08, and you're listening to BC Today. And during yesterday's show, we asked how you felt after Donald Trump's victory in the U.S. election. Many of you joined our live discussion with both praise and criticism for another Trump presidency. But here are some of the emails we have since received. David writes, "I think that Trump will become an authoritarian president with leanings to become a theocracy in order to stay in power with a Republican government. Trump has done everything to divide the population to us and them. The U.S. has given away their democracy. Project 2025 will be enacted. Stupidity prevails." Lynn writes, "The outcome was a victory for fear, hatred, and Putin. Unfortunately, a lot of the world is following this path." Linda says, "I'm very disappointed in the election outcome. I don't think men are ready for a female leader. I don't think white women in USA are ready for a black female leader. I'm concerned all the women that won't have a right over their own health. I would be very surprised if things improved for anyone except the rich." Lorraine says, "The world is now in a very unsafe place, and if Pierre Poilievre gets in, we will be facing what the U.S. is now facing. Very scary." And from Cheryl, "I'm very disappointed in the results of the U.S. election. With unchecked power, Trump is going to go ahead with his agenda. I fear what will happen to the U.S. and the world." And for the full review of the discussion, you can listen to the show again on the CBC Listen app and watch us on demand on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. And vote counting for the BC election will finally conclude with judicial recounts in 2 ridings taking place today and tomorrow. And for more on what this entails and what it could mean, we're joined by CBC reporter Karen Larson. Hi, Karen. Hi, Karen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, we're all on the same page now. So, what is
Yeah.
happening today in the Surrey Guildford?
Well, as you mentioned, this is a judicial recount. It's the process that automatically kicked in because how close the final results were here in Surrey Guildford. NDP incumbent Gary Begg has a 27 vote lead over Conservative candidate Hanveer Singh Randhawa.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we are here at this nondescript kind of warehouse slash retail space where the recount is taking place. They are recounting by hand over 19,000 ballots that were cast in this electoral district, of course, with the margin between the two candidates so narrow and the balance of power, too, hanging on this. We know the NDP has a bare majority right now, the way things stand. So this is a serious and important process expected to last into tomorrow.
Okay. Maybe if you could just sort of describe an overview of what you're seeing and that process that's underway right now.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, actually. I wasn't sure what I was walking into this morning. I don't think many people were. So here we are at this kind of, it is a big, empty warehouse space, about 10 ground level. The windows are about 10 feet tall, but there's baffles up against them, so people can't see in.
Okay.
And and it's being overseen by Supreme Court Justice Kevin Liu. He is presiding in what is pretty much a satellite BC Supreme Court courtroom, I'd say. Justice Liu is at one end of this large room. The counters and scrutineers are at the other end. And like I said, 19,000 individual ballots to go through. So there are 10 teams, four, I want to say, lined up at two long tables. There's two election officials. So one holds up the ballot for the two scrutineers, one from the Conservatives and one from the NDP to look at. And if they agree that that ballot was cast for a certain candidate, that is marked. Now, what happens when there's a disagreement? Well, that's when the court process sort of kicks in. Mostly the disagreements are over the admissibility of a ballot. And I could talk a little bit more about what happens there because we've actually just gone through the first process with Justice Liu about this. So one example was a ballot that was marked for more than one candidate. Actually, there's been a couple of this, but there's one in particular was really fascinating. It comes down to, I guess, what you would call the Elections Act, and whether or not the voter showed clear intention to pick one over the other. And there were arguments from both sides. So a legal team from the NDP, a legal team from the Conservatives, one arguing that their candidate should receive this vote, the other one arguing that this ballot should in fact be thrown out because it doesn't really meet the mark when it comes to the Election Act. So in this particular case, one of the circles was filled out with something that looked kind of like a Y, maybe part of an X for one candidate, and there was a line through the circle for the other candidate. And what Justice Liu ended up ruling after some consideration and deliberation, and he did deliver his decision from the desk, it's not quite a bench in this room we're in, that ballot didn't really count because it looked like someone had intentionally marked two of the circles, meaning that they had voted for two candidates and those ballots are not allowed. So there you go.
It is fascinating, and I think what you're describing, it just really speaks to the high bar that is set for this process and just how serious it is. When I'm thinking there's somebody out there, perhaps, completely unaware that there's been so much scrutiny on this one ballot that they may be deliberately or non-deliberately, spoiled in some way. It's just, it's all very fascinating that it comes down to that. Karen, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Amy.
All right, take care out there. That is CBC reporter Karen Larson, and she was joining us from Surrey. And of course, during the provincial election, both the BC NDP and the BC Conservatives promised significant tax cuts in their platforms as a way of easing pressure on the cost of living. Now that the NDP has been re-elected, what exactly could these cuts mean for you? And will they actually help or hinder the economy? So what impact do you think the NDP tax cuts could have on you? And what impact will they have on BC? Call us now at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. You can email bctoday@cbc.ca. Now, for more, we're joined by Alex Hemingway, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for having me.
So, you released a report earlier this morning that tax cuts could actually worsen the affordability challenges that we have here. How so?
Yeah, I think there's a discussion that we need to have, given that both major parties put tax cuts on the table, as you said off the top. The reality is we know that households are facing cost of living pressures in this province, but I think the challenge here is that tax cuts won't actually address the underlying causes of those cost of living pressures, whether that's high housing prices, the need for more childcare spaces and affordable ones, or the need for more investment in our transportation infrastructure. Many of those big day-to-day costs, addressing them actually requires that we invest together as a society through our institutions of government to meet some of those big challenges, to build affordable housing, build out those childcare spaces, build out efficient and affordable public transit. I think, we've seen some strong promises in terms of increasing those social investments in the election platform as well. And so that's positive. But when we think about sustaining those types of investments for the longer term, I think we should be wary about structurally reducing provincial revenues by $1.3 billion, which, for example, one of the NDP's main tax cut would do.
So, I mean, in a sense, should we actually be looking at raising taxes as opposed to reducing them, sort of to spend more money, to save more money down the road?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that should be in the mix in terms of discussions at this time. One is, this is both good for social policy and makes sense economically and fiscally, is to tax those at the very top, the richest British Columbians and the largest corporations. There's a lot of appetite for that when you look at what Canadians say, for example, in public opinion polls, and that could help shore up that provincial revenue and increase and sustain those social investments that are really important to helping working class and middle class households. And the other thing is, I think we should look at something like the $1.3 billion middle class tax cut that's been proposed and ask ourselves, is that the best use of those funds, or would those be better put towards social programs and supports and existing cash transfers that are more targeted and that help middle income and low income households?
It is tough, though, when somebody in that middle or low income is struggling economically and having to budget and count every dollar that they have. To think that they could be saving money if certain taxes were cut. How do we sort of make sure everybody is taken care of and understanding the reasoning behind these tax cuts or increases?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to say there. When we do cash support at the provincial government level, I think it's better to make sure that's well targeted, right? So one approach would be, the number was floated during the election campaign that this tax cut would cap out, that would be phased out for incomes above $125,000.
Right.
You could consider lowering that cap a little bit closer to the middle of the income distribution. And the other thing I think is really important here is the tax cuts that were put forward by both parties. For example, the BC NDP tax cut, that's going to be an increase to the basic personal amount, to the basic deduction of income from provincial income tax, right? And so one of the challenges there is if you're on a very low income and you're not paying much provincial income tax, or maybe you're paying none at all, this is not going to actually help you at all. These are the folks who need the most help right now. A caveat to that is, this gets a little bit complex. In the first year, from what we see in the platform, they're talking about doing this as a rebate rather than a tax cut. So I'm hopeful that those lower income folks will be helped in the first year. But as we look ahead to the longer term proposed tax cut, I think, we need to ask some of these questions.
Okay. We do have a call that's come in from Jeff in Kelowna. Hi, Jeff. What are you wondering or feeling about these proposed tax cuts?
I do not believe they go far enough.
Okay. How so?
If you look at the world on a world stage, the UAE is the richest country in regards to oil reserves and natural resources. They have zero tax, income tax and sales tax. If you look at Canada, we're the third richest, and we have some of the highest taxes in the world. Our roads are crap. Our medical is crap. And where all these taxes go is beyond me. The government is not held accountable for what they spend, whether it's provincial, city, or federal. They need to rein it in, be held accountable for every dollar they spend, whether it's on healthcare or whether it's on flying around the province or country for meetings. There's no accountability for any of the people, as far as I can see, in the government.
All right, Jeff, I appreciate that. And Alex, of course, he's referring to the United Arab Emirates when he's referring to the richest country in the world. But how does that sort of ring, or does that ring true for you at all in terms of sort of being this resource-rich country?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of key pieces of context here. One is, we've been down the road of tax cuts and spending cuts before in BC. So about 2 decades ago, when the BC Liberal government was in power, we saw very deep tax and spending cuts. Now, those tax cuts happened to disproportionately benefit the rich, and we saw deep cuts to social services. I was in high school in Prince George at the time. We saw mass school closures. We saw healthcare workers have their wages cuts and contracted out. We didn't see the investment we needed in areas like childcare or infrastructure. We saw public lands sold off. So I say all that because, part of the cost of living challenges that we face today are a result of that earlier era of tax and spending cuts, of austerity. And just to address directly one of the points that was made, is BC a high tax, high spending jurisdiction? Well, if you look at provincial government revenue and spending as a share of GDP, so as a share of our total economic pie, that dropped sharply 2 decades ago when those previous cuts happened. And it actually hasn't recovered since. So even though we've seen some, I think, very important reinvestment in social programs in the past few years, that spending as a share of GDP is still lower than it was 25 years ago. And I think actually we should be looking at restoring that fiscal capacity, that ability to invest in social services, by taxing those at the very top.
All right. We do have an email from Scott. He writes, in BC, we could adopt a simple, fair land tax that supports everyone. A 1% tax on land values across the province could generate enough revenue to provide a citizen dividend, $400 monthly for every adult or $1,600 for a family of 4. Unlike income taxes, this approach is efficient and fair as land values increase due to community growth, not individual effort. The land tax and dividend system would mean shared prosperity, reducing income inequality, and creating a stable source of support for all British Columbians. Alex, what's your response to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and one that's close to my heart. We actually published a report last year called Taxing Land Wealth for the Public Good. So I think there's a lot of merit in land value taxes. We put forward some options, some that would be broader based, some that would very narrowly target the wealthiest landowners. Real estate wealth in British Columbia in the past 2 decades has increased by over $1.7 trillion. So there's a huge potential tax base there. And I think, in that spirit of taxing those at the very top, that taxing the wealthiest landowners would be one smart avenue to go in terms of raising revenue that can then be put towards reducing the cost of living for many people through social investments. So I'm glad that was put on the table.
And Anne writes, couldn't we reduce taxes for those with lower incomes and raise taxes for the wealthier? And I think that's a mindset that so many people do support. It's just not always as black and white or as easy I suppose, to enact that. One thing I want to touch on is obviously removing the carbon tax garnered a lot of attention for both the NDP and the BC Conservatives in both good and bad ways. What would this actually mean, though, for us here in BC?
Yeah, I think, there are a lot of question marks around that. That's not something that's going to happen immediately. The commitment that was made was to remove the consumer portion of the carbon tax if and when the federal government eliminates that requirement. So, that's not going to come up, for example, in the next BC budget, most likely. I don't think that will have happened by then, but that may be an eventuality down the road if there's a change in federal government. And I think there are a number of things to keep in mind here. I think it is good to be maintaining the carbon tax on industrial emitters. I'm glad to see that was the case. One concern, if the consumer carbon tax is cut, one is, of course, the loss of revenue for public services, as we've been talking about. Another is, would things like the climate action tax credit be maintained? So that's a tax credit in BC that goes to low and middle income earners, and that's where a significant portion of the consumer carbon tax revenue goes. That could actually leave lower income households worse off if the carbon tax is cut and that tax credit is eliminated. So, I hope that's not the approach we see, but, we didn't see that level of detail in the commitments during the election, so it's hard to say.
And we do have time for just one final call, and this is from Vicky on the Sunshine Coast. Hi, Vicky.
Hi.
And what are your thoughts on the proposed tax cuts from the NDP?
Well, my reason for calling is that I couldn't let the earlier caller get away with saying that we are in Canada, our leaders are not held to account for the expenditures that we make. He held the United Arab Emirates up as an example of accountability and denigrated the Canadian system. And I just have to say that the UAE is an autocracy. They are accountable to no one other than the autocrats. And we have a democracy here. And our leaders, if we don't like them, have elections and we can vote them out.
No,
and we do regularly.
That is a very fair point, and I really appreciate you bringing that up, Vicky. Thank you. Alex, before we let you go, I suppose I just want to ask, what do you think BC's economic future is, both in the short and the long term? What do you sort of predict, if anything?
Yeah, so I think we're in a challenging economic environment across Canada at this time, and that only reinforces the need for public investment. We need to, and so that has a stimulating effect in the short term, but more importantly, in the longer term, we know we need to get a handle on challenges like the housing crisis. That's a big squeeze on households, but it's also a problem for businesses trying to recruit workers. So, we can improve our long-term economic productivity and growth by continuing to invest in social priorities, in housing, in infrastructure, in transportation, in childcare that helps young parents participate in the workforce. So, sometimes economic growth and public spending are pitted against each other. But, particularly when we've been through a period of austerity and underinvestment in critical areas like these, we actually for the sake of our economy, for the sake of economic growth, need to sustain and increase those important social investments at this time.
All right. And I lied. We do have time for one more phone call. This last word goes to Ken in Port Alberni. Hi, Ken.
Hi. Thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, of course. You snuck in under the wire.
Oh, boy. Thank you. So I'm recently retired. I'm 71 years old.
Okay.
I couldn't retire at 65. And my point is, regarding the taxes, is for senior citizens. Senior citizens worked hard and built this province and paid their dues and taxes over the years, and they really should have a break. Now that I am a senior, I'm kind of an advocate for that. But also, real simple, if we put more money in the people's pockets instead of taking it out with taxes, they will spend that money and generate jobs, generate the economy,
for sure,
and boost everything up. So when I have extra money in my pocket, I spend it, and I might buy whatever. But the point is, if the government keeps taking taxes out of our pockets, we don't have that spending power anymore, and so it's going to hurt the economy that way.
All right.
So that's basically my point.
And that's a very fair point, Ken. I thank you. Alex, we've got about 30 seconds left till the news, but what is your response to less taxes for the seniors?
Yeah, look, I think we have to recognize that seniors and people all across the age and income spectrum, many people are feeling the squeeze right now in terms of the cost of living. So that has to be addressed. I think if we want to address it in a structural way that's going to make change for the long term, we do have to make public investments, and we should look to fund that through more taxes on those at the very top, as well as cash assistance to those who need it most. That's really the way forward if we want to deal with some of the very big challenges that have mounted for us here in British Columbia and Canada as a society.
All right, Alex, we'll leave it there, but always lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy.
Alex Hemingway is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative. And this is BC Today, and the CBC News with Robert Zimmerman is next.
Good afternoon. The RCMP say one person is dead after a shooting last night close to downtown Prince George. Police tape surrounds an empty lot and part of the sidewalk along Victoria Street. RCMP say the attack appears to be targeted. Police say a 21-year-old man has died after failing to stop for police and crashing his motorcycle in East Vancouver. They say the man went through a traffic stop near East Hastings and Victoria shortly after 9 o'clock last night. Police say he reportedly crashed into several vehicles and a tree near Victoria and 8th. And the judicial recount has begun for the Surrey-Guildford riding, which was won by the NDP by just 27 votes. Elections officials arrived this morning at an industrial building in Surrey, where Supreme Court Justice Kevin Liu called the session into order before hand counting began for ballots in the riding of Surrey-Guildford. Elections BC says more than 19,000 ballots have to be counted. And now the forecast on the north coast. Showers this afternoon with strong winds and a high of 11. Highs around 10 with rain and some sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, mainly cloudy and windy with a high of 10 as well. Highs up to 5 degrees with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, some sunshine this afternoon with a high of 7. And mainly cloudy in Greater Victoria, a mix of sun and cloud in Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley with highs around 13. That's your CBC News update from Vancouver.
Thank you, Robert. Robert, are you a big baker?
Amy? I'm not a huge baker. I know you are. Fantastic
I know
baker.
you do like to eat some baking.
I do.
Yes.
I like baked goods.
Okay, well, whether you like to bake or you just like to partake in baked goods, stick around for our next segment. We're going to talk to a local amateur baker who has been trying to win the Great Canadian Bake Off. So he'll be with us in just a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, you should compete against him, I think. I think you would do very well, Amy.
Thank you, Robert. And the federal government says it's time up for TikTok. The Chinese-owned social media company has been ordered to shut down its business operations in Canada. Innovation Minister François-Philippe Champagne says national security concerns led to the federal government's decision, but emphasized that Canadians can still use the social media app.
The decision we took was to protect the national security of Canada on the basis of the analysis that we conducted with our security services. And we came to the conclusion that these activities that were conducted in Canada by TikTok at their offices would be injurious to national security. I expect everyone to understand that when it comes to national security, there could be no compromise.
And this season's Great Canadian Baking Show has not one, but two BC competitors. And not only are they both avid bakers, they're both involved in finance. Jen Childs is a bookkeeper from Esquimalt, and Markus Tam is a tax manager from Vancouver. But we do have some disappointing news today. Markus was eliminated from the competition on Sunday for the Arts and Crafts Week, leaving 5 bakers from across Canada to race and bake for the top spot this season. And the show's Instagram post for Markus leaving was filled with supportive fan comments this morning, praising him for his creativity and artistry, with many saying they were very sad to see him go and that they wished him well. Well, you don't have to watch him go because Markus joins us now, and we will talk with him more about his time on the show coming up. But first, we want to hear from you. What are your biggest baking tips and tricks? And what is your biggest baking fail? Don't be ashamed. You can share it with us. Call us with your baking questions and quandaries for Markus. Call us at 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, or pound 690 on your cell phone, and you can email bctoday@cbc.ca. Markus, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very honored.
Oh, well, I'm honored as well. Many people have said that they thought you were headed straight for the top 3 of the Bake Off. So what happened? Where did things, perhaps go a little wrong?
All the 10 bakers are very talented. Yeah. And, I feel like, I think a lot of people say that, everyone has a potential to win, and that it just so happens, sometimes you may have a bad bake, a bad day. And, in this case, it just happened to me, focaccia bread is a little bit burnt. And then, showstopper, just had a little bit of trouble with the cake, but marzipan fondant wrapping. But, in the end, it's been an amazing experience, and I didn't expect to experience this. Yeah. So it's nothing but good memories for me.
That is good to hear. I'm laughing a bit because you just mentioned 2 of my personal baking nemesis, which is focaccia. I've never been able to do it where it tastes great, and second is fondant. It's like
yeah, it was,
strikes terror in my heart.
it was coming into this competition. What I kind of like to bake is kind of more French pastries, tarts, entremets. So that's like mousse cakes. So coming into this competition, there was stuff like using fondant or icing cookies and stuff. So that was things I had to learn before coming onto show and practicing. So especially with the fondant, it was, to me, I think the other bakers, you can see some of their talents, Laura, who's just really good at just with the fondant, and you saw Jen's showstopper. It was really beautiful. But for me, I try my best, and I learned a lot from it, and I hope to probably gonna try to use it more now.
Yeah. Well, you look like you were having fun, and that I think is the most important thing. What were some of the highlights of appearing on the show and your experience with them?
I think the highlight, a lot of what the bakers would also say is that just meeting them. For me, me being in business, I around a lot of business professionals. Sure. So just coming into this, you meet people that you maybe wouldn't have met. And in this case, I would say that was so for me, and it was just we formed a very strong bond. It's not easy, coming into these bakes, the time pressure and everything. And I think after we finish baking, we all talk about it together, and sometimes from hardships a little bit, you kind of build a strong bond, right? So
trauma bonding,
sorry,
I think they call it.
Not hardship, just it was a lot of fun. But for
sure.
us amateur bakers, it's tough,
And a very unique experience, but one with a lot of pressure attached to it, and a very steep learning curve. So I would think you'd all sort of band together. We would love to have people call in though, and if they have questions or comments for you, but also share their baking tips or their biggest baking fails. We actually have a baking fail, I believe, now from Tamara in North Vancouver. Hi, Tamara. Are you brave enough to share your fail?
Of course I am. You can learn from my failure, although I don't know where I went wrong, so maybe someone can diagnose.
Okay.
So My failure this morning actually started yesterday. So I woke up really early because I have a teenage son, and I sometimes, if I can get out of bed before him, then I'll bake. So I was going to bake scones, and I thought, okay, cranberry, blueberry. So I mixed up the dry stuff before I put in the butter. I realized that I didn't have eggs.
Oh, okay.
And so I just left everything in the mixer. It's a food processor, so I could add butter, and I would pulse it, and it would get crumbly. So I had the flour, sugar, baking powder, and whatever else I needed. Left that in the food processor, put a towel over it, of course. I got the eggs last night. I made everything this morning, and I thought it seemed a little bit liquidy, a little runny, and we were running late. So I thought I'll turn on the convection. So I put these lovely mounds of dough onto 2 cookie sheets, put them in the oven. I came back to check them in 15 minutes, and they had all gone together like one big cookie sheet.
One pool of scone.
Oh, my goodness. I called my son in, and I've never heard him laugh that hard in the morning. Normally, he's not a morning guy. The good news is that I shut off the convection. I let the top cook because the top was kind of quite soft. The edges were burned. And he said, in the end, Mama, they were delicious. So it's kind of a win, kind of a fail.
You know what? That's all that really matters. Marcus, any thoughts? First blush, what could have gone wrong there for the for the massive? I guess just turned into one big scone in the end.
The sheet scone.
Yeah. So maybe it depends on maybe the environment you're working with, because the scone has butter in it. So I think a good thing to do would be put it in the freezer for a little bit before putting it into the oven, because if it's kind of warm, the butter is already melting into the dough, and then so when you put it into the oven, it might just melt, like kind of heat up really fast and melt.
That's what I was thinking.
Away. Yeah, and then if you put it in the it's kind of similar to pie crust. You always want to work with it when it's cold. So if it's getting a bit warm and you feel it leaking a little bit or getting sticky on your hands, I would say maybe put it in the freezer or just fridge for freezer for 5 minutes, fridge for 15 minutes, and maybe it'll be easier to work with and it wouldn't puddle up.
All right. Caroline, Tamara, I'm going to say that if they tasted good and it brought you and your son an early morning laugh, we're not going to consider that a failure on any level.
Taste is important. So if it's good in the taste, then I would say it's not a failure.
No, not at all. But thank you for that very much. Marcus, you had 3 baking challenges. Yes. So the signature bake, the technical bake, and the showstopper. Yes. And I have to do jazz hands when I say it. It just seems appropriate. What was your favorite out of those 3?
I would say they were all pretty stressful. So I would say technical's the hardest one because it's truly a blind bake. And it's like, when you're watching these cooking shows, when they remove the veal, it's kind of like that. So that would be 3rd for me. Signature, given the time, we're around usually 2 hours and stuff. So that's pretty fun to do. It's still very challenging, but, you're kind of a little bit prepped, have some practice for it.
Right.
And so I would say, that would be, I'd enjoy that. And then
which one was the showstopper?
The showstopper is like the final one, the big set
The
piece,
jazz
right?
hands
So
piece?
that one's usually like a 3.5 to 4 hour bake.
Okay.
So, we do have some time to practice before coming onto the show. And, I just never got within the time, I was like 6 hours or something like that, right? So it's a big commitment, so going on to the show, I was surprised, I could finish within the time,
And for the showstopper, what did it look like? Was this, we saw the sun, was
Yes.
it? That was your showstopper?
Yeah. So that was one of the showstoppers.
Impressive.
That one was a bit challenging in the beginning to come up with the idea. I actually had the first draft for that sun cake. I was using some isomalt sugar, so that's kind of like using sugar work, but I wasn't too good with that. So I thought so then it came to this
There
where
we
I used
go. That is a showstopper.
molding chocolate, to make the sun rays, and then so I was happy with this turnout, actually. It was really hot this day. Like, it was
Right.
like 30 to 35 degrees, and we were all working with buttercream. So,
Oh, that's
you
a
know,
nightmare.
on my hand as I was piping it, I could feel like, usually it's a bit harder,
I
but
know,
it was
you can
just
almost
leaking
feel it
out.
like separating and
Yeah.
melting a little bit. I've been there. I've done a couple of cakes
Yeah.
just for friends' weddings, and it's a lot of stress.
Yes,
and it
it
takes a
is.
lot longer. I can see you sweating in this
Oh
photo.
yes, I naturally I sweat a lot, but
Well,
imagine
I'm
this
the
one,
same.
with the temperature and the nervousness.
I
Yeah.
think that perfectly sums up what it's like to try to do one of these big cakes
Yes.
that is supposed to stop people in their tracks. You're gonna sweat. We do have an email in from
Okay, yeah.
Caroline. She writes, "I have been using parchment paper in my baking recently, as it seems to be recommended. However, in my case, it does the opposite of what it is supposed to do. Particularly with my pastry baking, the end result is soggy and oily. What am I doing wrong?" I'm not sure. I'm a huge fan of parchment paper.
Yeah, I use parchment paper for the most part, but sometimes actually I don't use parchment paper. I use a perforated mat, a perforated silicone mat. So it's like a mat with little holes in it. I usually tend to use that because, the heat as it's coming out, it gets distributed better because the heat doesn't stay in one spot. It actually dissipates a little bit. So, I like it because it's good for, I like how it browns my goods.
All right.
But I feel maybe it's the temperature of the oven, maybe a lot of times, or, you could place it on the bottom. Like, depends also where you're putting it in the oven. If you're putting it in the middle, it's hotter because hot air rises.
Yes.
So if you put it on the bottom, it will cook, maybe it will just brown less, or it might prevent it from burning.
Okay, all good tips. We do have a call now from
Yeah.
Marie in Abbotsford. Hi, Marie.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going very well. Now, do you have a tip or
I
perhaps
do.
a fail?
Yeah.
Oh, please share.
This is a shout out to my friend's mom, Cherry, out in Three Hills, Alberta. Anyways, she taught me how to bake brownies by using so you take a flat sheet of tin foil,
Okay.
and if your baking pan is like 9 by 13, you cut out basically a 6 by 3 internal square of the tin foil.
Mm-hmm.
And then you put your baking pan on top of that. So the middle is exposed to the full heat of the oven, and then the external pieces are a little bit less exposed. And then you end up with very evenly cooked brownies. Normally they're chewy in the middle and really brown on the outside, or black sometimes.
Yep.
Anyways, you add a few extra minutes and you got really evenly baked brownies.
That's brilliant. I love
I
that.
agree with that. Yeah.
And I love
Good
that
tip.
one thing that I've noticed, especially since the pandemic, TikTok is full of all these sort of like baking hacks that people, as she said, she got that from her friend's mother, and it's probably been used throughout their family for years, but there's a way to sort of move it forward and people can share those things. Although I know a lot of people do like those crispy edges around their brownies, so
Preference for everyone.
It
you know,
is.
like same as cookies. Some people like you bake a bit longer, you get a harder
Yeah.
cookie, and then some people like soft. I like both. So.
I like both as well, so I'm never too picky. What is your favorite thing to bake, though?
I
Do you have that one comfort or one showstopper of your own?
have, there's moments where I feel like baking's the same thing a lot. So there was a time I was making a lot of croissants. I love puff pastry. I like lamination dough. So that's where you fold. You have like a dough, and then you encapsulate the butter on it, a butter block, and then you just keep rolling and folding. I kind of it's very therapeutic for me. So, and then also, you just get really flaky, buttery goods.
Nothing better.
Scares me how much butter it takes.
You know what? We're
but
going to embrace the butter. We're not going to
Yeah.
fear butter anymore because it's necessary in baking sometimes. But I do find like there is nothing better than a really good croissant.
yeah, I love them. I like to go out to eat them, but in the bakeries, when they start making a lot of them, they have like a sheeting machine, so a dough sheeter. So they just put it in, and then it just goes in and out so it takes away some of the manual labor.
Yeah.
But they already know how to make it. But in bulk, they got to do that,
I
right?
suppose so.
Yeah. But at home, it just takes a lot of time. But when it turns out with that honeycomb structure, it's worth it.
Yeah, you feel that pride, and it is worth it. We do have an email from Dan. He writes, if you don't have eggs for baking, do what vegans do by mixing flaxseed or chia seed eggs. It works great for most baking. And we do have to realize there are wonderful vegan bakeries that aren't using butter or any dairy or eggs, and there are these little workarounds. Have you ever explored those sort of vegan options or had to for friends?
I think my fiance one time she went to, I think we went to a vegan bakery, or is it? Oh, sorry, that was gluten free.
Okay.
Sorry, bakery. So I'm not as exposed to it, but I know it's it's a big thing. Like to be able to make you don't want vegans to kind of lose out on the baked goods.
No, not at all.
It's it's for everyone. Baking's for everyone, right? So maybe I'm like, oh, maybe I might be interested in trying it one day. But it's there's a lot of creative ways like that baking tip just now.
New challenges.
Yes, new challenges.
We have an email from Simon, and he writes, a friend and I were about 12 years old back in the 1990s in South Africa, and we decided to bake a lemon meringue pie. The South African version is made with canned condensed milk, which is already super sweet. I accidentally misread the recipe and ended up using a kilogram of sugar on top of the condensed milk. The pie was inedible. I've since turned into a pretty good baker. I think every baker has one of those stories.
Oh, I've been through a lot of baking fails, especially in the beginning. For example, what I started with when I started baking, I kind of skipped the kind of cookies and a bit of the cakes, and I just went to it's called choux au craquelin. So that's like a cream puff, and then you have like a craquelin on top. So it took me a few tries to get it to rise, and then sometimes there was one time my oven has like a black film on it, like filter, so it's kind of hard to see if it's golden brown yet, but it already rose up, and I was like, oh, it looks good. So then I was like, I need to see if it's brown, and then I open it, and I was like, okay, still needs a little bit of browning, but that's the rule you never do. You all that air heat comes out, and then closed it, and then a minute later look at it, and it already deflated because it just didn't harden enough yet. It didn't brown enough. So you never do that with choux pastry, or else it's just gonna deflate. Deflates the heart, but I just went on to make another batch.
That's the spirit. Now I do want to talk about your pig cake.
Oh yes.
Because I think it's the most adorable thing I've ever seen. Look at it there. It is a little cartoon pig that just looks like it just looks so adorable.
Thank you.
Tell us about the process of doing this, because this was the fondant that you were talking about having difficulty with.
So, the inspiration for the pig, I have, I'm sure a lot of people have their first stuffed animal. And this was literally my first stuffed animal growing up. I called him, as a kid, you're not creative with the name. So you just add a Y to everything. So Piggy in this case, right? So I think in the show, I showed a picture of me holding Piggy. And actually, he made an intro in week 2 when I was doing the cookie showstopper.
Right.
I did a little pig marzipan. And then, I said, oh, maybe for Cartoon Week, let me showcase Piggy on a more bigger scale. So then, that from the start, that was just my first idea, and then I just kept with it. And it was a tall pig, right? And then so I think the challenge was rolling out the marzipan is very fragile. So to put it over the pig, it cracked a little bit, and had a few. Actually, they didn't show it here, but in the butt area, it had like a crack. So I took some of that fondant, the black fondant.
Most butts do.
Yeah,
But
I put an X around it, so it's like like a knit, right? And then
I love it.
Alan, he was kind of having a laugh on that one.
I think Piggy is adorable. Do you find any? You're in accounting and banking. Do you find any similarities between baking and that arena? I always sort of think of science in baking, but what about sort of math and baking?
Yeah, being CPA accountant, it's we're not. We have Excel to help us calculate math, but it's a lot about attention to detail, and I think that's how I approach my baking. For me, I tend to use a scale, because when you use a cup, for example, a cup of flour, it depends. If you pack it in really hard, it's kind of off. It might be heavier, right? A lot of variables. So for me, being exact is a big thing. Even for my baked goods, like how high it rises and stuff like that. It's like, oh, I kind of wanted to kind of rise high. And in terms of, I think that drives my perfection. It's not always, and it's harder, when you aim for perfection, which, it's always room for improvement. But, when you kind of get near there and you kind of want a taste of, the same result, it doesn't always happen. No. And then, it's a bit of, for me, just a lot of troubleshooting, I'm just reading up on it and stuff. So that's kind of where, being kind of very in this kind of business field, being detail oriented and, wanting, consistent results.
Yeah. I love that. We do have one last email, and Anita writes, my cooking disaster involved cookies and a piano recital. It was my annual Christmas piano recital for my students, and I was whipping up a batch of sugar cookies for the after-concert reception. As we were out of sugar in the upstairs sugar container, I trotted down to the basement where my husband, a chef with his own restaurant, stored staples like sugar and flour and salt in massive plastic tubs. I think I see where this is going. I helped myself to sugar and put together the recipe. I was stymied by the fact that the batter was exceptionally dry and had to add more and more milk to make the dough workable. Finally, I had to leave to prepare for the hall for the students and ask my husband and daughter to pop those cookies in the oven. My two chefs arrived just in the nick of time with huge grins on their face and ultra fresh cookies. They explained that they had to remake the batter from scratch as I'd used salt instead of sugar in the recipe.
Yeah, like you said, I was thinking about that.
No wonder my batter was so dry. I thanked my lucky stars for my quick thinking chefs and that no one was the wiser to my baking faux pas. Until now, that is. I also insist that they label all food bins in the future. I think, as I was saying, I think most chefs have a story of the sugar salt mix. I do recall my mother telling me a story about being so proud for her first, I think it was cake, that she'd made, and she served it proudly to her father, who very graciously smiled and said it was delicious. And then when she tasted it, of course, she realized that she had used salt instead of sugar. Marcus, what's next for you, quickly?
It was watching this episode. I knew it was coming, but gotta keep it. Mum's the word, right? So it was a harder episode, but it was it was just very enjoyable. It was an amazing experience, and you meet people that like a baking family, you know. Like a lot of the camaraderie, and I would say, a lot of us are quite close, and, we are texting and stuff like that. I told them, hey, I'm coming on today, so,
I hope they're watching. We are right out of time, but it was so wonderful to meet you. That is, of course, Marcus Tam, a Great Canadian Baking Show competitor from Season 8, and that is our show for today.